Coming up on 21st Century. For the thousands imprisoned here, it was hell on earth.
This place was full of cries, the screams of children, of mothers, of fathers.
Finally, the alleged mastermind of this inferno will face his victims.
The whole of humanity demands a just and proportionate response to these crimes.
But some are asking, what would you have done in his place?
Who today can say that they would have acted differently under these circumstances?
Hello and welcome to 21st Century. I'm Daljit Dhaliwal. From Nazi Germany to Rwanda to Yugoslavia, the world has attempted to bring some measure of justice to the victims of mass atrocities. But there has never been an international tribunal like the one in Cambodia, where a reign of terror decimated more than 1/4 of the population more than 3 decades ago. In this special edition of 21st Century, we take you inside the first case heard by this unique court. They came by the busload, gathered in villages throughout Cambodia, about to witness history in the making.
Today, in this courtroom, before the Cambodian people and the world, at long last, justice begins, and justice will be done.
It's the first post-genocide tribunal ever held in the nation where the atrocities were committed. It will put on the record secrets that many in this small Southeast Asian country want buried. It's been accused of being too expensive, too slow, too late. But for at least one of the victims of Cambodia's nightmare, it is as essential as air.
Every day I demand my government to bring the Khmer Rouge to justice. If we do not try them, the same cruel killings can happen again.
Chum May is haunted by powerful memories. His wife and 3 children were among the murdered. He was imprisoned and tortured. He cannot rest until his tormentor is held accountable.
This is Duch, the S-21 prison chief. Younger generations did not know Duch as master of criminals, who killed without mercy.
Who was Duch? Was he a master of criminals responsible for thousands of deaths? Or was he also a victim of the Khmer Rouge? This is the story of 2 men and a nation's long-delayed quest for justice. It all began in the 1970s. Southeast Asia was in turmoil. The Vietnam War was winding down, but civil war raged in neighboring Cambodia. On April the 17th, 1975, the communist Khmer Rouge seized power. Within 24 hours, Cambodia's capital, Phnom Penh, was emptied out. Its residents forcibly marched into the countryside with little but what they could carry. Those who resisted were shot.
I ran to the house and told my wife, pack up everything. I fled with my wife and children out of Phnom Penh.
Chum May was a 45-year-old mechanic when he was forced from Phnom Penh at gunpoint. The Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, were determined to return Cambodia to what they called Year Zero, an agrarian society. Most Cambodians were forced to labor in the fields. There would be no professionals, no schools, no money. But even as the population obeyed, the increasingly paranoid regime questioned everyone's loyalties, including Chum May's. On October 28, 1978, he was separated from his family, told he was being taken to repair vehicles. Instead, he was taken here to the notorious Tuol Sleng prison, a former school now known as S21.
I was handcuffed like this, and my face was covered with a blindfold. We were marched like this.
S21's inmates were teachers, lawyers, journalists. Each one meticulously photographed, men, women, and children.
This was where I was detained. This is my cell, number 022. This is the chain for shackling our legs. We slept with our legs shackled. If you got caught turning around without permission, you were beaten 50 to 100 times with a stick.
On Chum May's first day at S21, he was taken for interrogation inside this room. Its floor already covered in blood. The objective, to force him to confess to supposed foreign loyalties.
The interrogator demanded, "How many of you are associating with the CIA? You tell me frankly." I said, "I am not CIA or KGB, I did not know them." Then he quickly grabbed a stick and hit me.
The initial interrogations and torture continued for 12 agonizing days.
My toenails were pulled out. I was innocent and I was beaten. If I was doing something wrong, I would not have complained, but I was innocent and they beat me.
This brutal treatment was meted out routinely, says this former interrogator.
The torture included pounding fingers, inserting needles under fingernails, pulling them off with pliers.
Prak Korn, then just 20 years old, was taught to torture at S21.
He trained me on how to interrogate and how to torture in order to retrieve answers, how to use psychological and political tactics.
He was prison director Kangek Io, known as Comrade Duch. A former science teacher, Duch now taught the art of cruelty.
We placed plastic bags around their heads. We were trying to almost choke them. What we wanted was to weaken their minds.
But for inmates he deemed useful, Duch had special plans. Prisoner Van Nat had been an artist. Duch ordered him to paint portraits of Khmer Rouge leader Pol Pot.
Duch was the only one who decided if the painting was good enough.
Van Nat, who had been tortured at S21 so severely he could barely walk, knew that other artists before him had tried to please Duch. Most could not and were quickly put to death.
I worried how I could paint for him when I could not even stand.
Van Nat put his dark memories of those desperate days on canvas. The babies snatched from their mothers, the waterboarding, and other brutal torture techniques.
That time there was our hell on earth. S21 was hell because the prisoners, they were not dead, but their bodies were no longer human.
Responsible for all of it, he says, was one man, Duch.
He didn't look like a cruel person who killed so many people.
But thousands were killed. In fact, trucks rumbled out of S21 every night at midnight, taking away prisoners to be executed at nearby killing fields. Hearing this was its own kind of torture.
At 8 or 9 p.m. we could not sleep, just waiting there, without knowing who would be brought to die. Only after midnight could we finally close our eyes.
But even then, sleep was elusive. Too many other terrible sounds echoed in the night.
This place was full of cries, the screams of children, of mothers, of fathers. Sometimes babies who didn't have breast milk cried, while their mothers also cried upstairs because of torture.
It was all too much for some prisoners. Many attempted suicide.
Some prisoners, they soak themselves with kerosene from the lamps. They would burn themselves alive. Some would use a pen to stab their throats.
I wanted to commit suicide by jumping, but I couldn't because there were bars.
Salvation came on December the 25th, 1979. Vietnam, which had been the target of Khmer Rouge attacks, invaded Cambodia and overthrew the Pol Pot regime. Comrade Duch and the guards fled. Then the gates of S21 swung open and its secrets spilled out. At least 15,000 people had been imprisoned here. Only 12 survived. Among them, 4 children, the artist Van Nat and Chum May. Chum May ran, desperate to find his wife. Remarkably, he did. She was carrying their baby. But in the chaos, gunfire broke out. Chum May's wife and child were tragically shot dead.
I miss my wife. They should not have killed her with a small baby in her hands. Whenever I come here, my tears always fall.
The full measure of Cambodia's tragedy was stunning. Nearly 2 million, 1 in every 4 Cambodians had died. Many of starvation, exhaustion, and disease. Tens of thousands more executed at killing fields like this one. It was not until UN-brokered elections in 1993 that a degree of political stability finally came to Cambodia. Now, Chum May and so many other victims could finally demand a reckoning.
We need justice to help heal those who lost husbands, wives, and children.
The international community agreed. The most senior Khmer Rouge leaders would have to be prosecuted. But could Cambodia, where only 7 lawyers survived the Khmer Rouge, hold a legitimate trial? Negotiations would drag on for years. But at long last, an historic UN-supported tribunal was approved. The verdict would be decided by an international panel of judges, some Cambodian, some foreign. Case number 1 finally began in early 2009, more than 30 years after the genocide. The first defendant, held behind bulletproof glass, was the alleged mastermind of S21's machinery of death, Comrade Duch. The charges: murder, war crimes and crimes against humanity. Co-prosecutor Chia Liang began.
The evidence will show that his crimes were part of a widespread and systematic attack on the Cambodian population.
In the packed courtroom sat Chum May, now 79, as his former captor made a dramatic confession.
I would like to say that I am responsible for the crimes committed at S21. Especially the torture and the execution of the people there.
But Duch, now 67, insisted he had no choice. It was obey or die.
It was a life or death situation for me and for my family. As the person who was in charge of S21, I could never consider defying orders, even though obeying them meant that numerous people would perish.
Did Duch order torture and killings willingly or out of fear? Was he a zealot or a pawn? The trial would pivot on these questions. Co-prosecutor William Smith.
The defence will say that he was a victim of the regime, had no choice, hated his job, and only carried out these acts because he was under threat of death. It's not a valid defence, duress of itself.
Duch acted out of conviction, not coercion, says Smith.
He was, say, a crusader, someone that wanted the revolution, the communist revolution, and did everything he could to achieve that.
Everything, including devising ingenious methods of torture and teaching them, as former interrogator Prak Korn testified.
We were trained on how to whip the prisoners with a stick, on how to electrocute them, how to use the plastic bag to suffocate them.
As for the question of duress, Van Nat, the artist who had survived on Duch's whim, testified that Duch never appeared scared or anxious.
S21 was his domain, and he was the boss. We were afraid of him, and we had to respect him. Every time he entered, I had to stand up and then wait for his instructions.
We must consider everything in order to judge a person.
Defense attorney Francois Roux argues that Duch was not born an executioner, he became one.
At first, he joined the revolution full of good intentions. So he stuck his hand in, then his arm, and then he was entirely engulfed in it. Who today can say that they would have acted differently under these circumstances? Circumstances under which one is absolutely terrified.
What's more, Roux contends Duch is now full of remorse. He says everyone, including Duch's victims, could see that when, as part of the trial, the court took him back to S21, the site of his crimes. As he waited to speak, Duch broke down.
I know that my regret, although it is so hurtful, it is only a drop of water in a vast ocean of misery for victims and their families.
But Duch was about to confront the misery he had inflicted when Chum May described his torture.
One day, they put a wire in my ear and electrocuted me. I could only hear the noise of the generator. Sparks came out of my eyes.
I can confirm that what Chum May is saying is not an exaggeration. He did suffer like that. I apologize.
But what would Duch's apologies mean to Chum May? When he finally testified more than a year later, Cambodia got its answer.
I cannot allow a few teardrops to wash away the suffering of the more than 2 million Cambodian people who perished during the regime.
The scars of his miserable days at Tuol Sleng prison are still raw.
Every time I hear about the Khmer Rouge, I think about my wife and kids. I didn't expect I would survive. I only lay down on my back, waiting to be killed.
So, what is a just sentence for this accused? Do you believe him when he says he was a hostage and a prisoner of the regime from 19...
Where the judges stood on that question would determine Duch's punishment. Co-prosecutor Smith implores the court to remember the thousands of Duch's defenceless victims.
Your Honours should be mindful of the dreams and opportunities that were denied. That the whole of humanity demands a just and proportionate response to these crimes. And this court must speak on behalf of that humanity.
Smith demanded a sentence of 40 years in prison, while defence attorney Rue argued that Duch's contrition warrants a sentence of time served.
Who is in a position to dispute and challenge the tears that have been wept by the accused? Duch has already paid for the evil that he committed. Send him back home. Send him home.
But in the trial's final hours, Rue and everyone else was in for a shock. Despite the fact that Duch had confessed several times, suddenly his other defence attorney, Kar Savuth, demanded a total acquittal. He argued that more senior members of the Khmer Rouge, not Duch, were responsible.
He only obeyed the party, so the party is the culprit, the criminal behind all the crimes. I request that now Duch be free from being prosecuted.
Even Duch seemed startled by his lawyer's about-face.
I am responsible for the crimes as a member of the criminal party.
In an atmosphere of confusion, the court adjourned to deliberate. More than 8 months later, the judges filed in to deliver their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, 35 years in prison. Minus the time he has already served, Duch will be incarcerated for another 19 years. He showed no emotion, but outside, Chum May was devastated. For him, the sentence was a travesty.
I ask all of you whether the world will be happy for spending millions of dollars and the killers don't get punished. Are you happy with that? I am not happy. My tears fall one more time. My countrymen's tears fall one more time.
For Duch's victims, it is now more important than ever to keep the memory of those who perished alive. Van Nat's paintings are his tribute to the dead.
They did not die in vain. They were not smashed like ash. Their memories and evidence of their lives remain.
Chum May continues to bear witness. He spends his days at S21, now a memorial to the dead. Despite his disappointment, he is proud of his testimony in the trial that finally forced his homeland to confront its terrible history.
It's very important. I do not want the younger generation to say that there was a very old man who knew the truth about the Khmer Rouge regime and he never revealed it. That he just dies with that truth.
The Tribunal's second case will begin next year. Pol Pot died 12 years ago, but 4 senior members of his regime now face an array of charges, including genocide. That's all for this edition of 21st Century. I'm Daljit Dhaliwal. We will see you next time. Until then, goodbye.